Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Fraser. I head up the domestic energy business within the institutional bank at CBA. Australia is blessed with renewable resource, strong solar and wind. However, our grid is designed around centralised generation, large coal-fired power stations with high voltage transmission lines to transport the electrons from those power stations to major demand centres in cities. As we look to bring in renewable generation, that generation is spread across the grid, and we need to augment the grid to be able to facilitate those strong renewable resources. We need to have a managed transition. We can't just turn coal-fired power stations off until we're ready. Energy security is paramount. Gas is expected to continue to play a role in the system to protect against periods of low renewable resource. So I'm joined on stage by an expert panel today. I have to say I'm feeling a little bit out of place because we were talking before and it turns out that both, Merryn, Tim and Suzanne all worked at the AMC together at the same time, so they're all familiar. So just quickly, Merryn is the head of system design at AEMO, so the Australian Energy Market Operator. She's responsible for driving a coordinated approach towards a net zero energy system. Tim is the head of energy markets at Iderdrola. You may not have heard of Iderdrola. They are a large global renewable energy business with a grid business headquartered in Spain. If listed on the ASX, they'd be a top 5 company by market capitalisation. Tim is also a leading energy market economist in Australia. He's got research published widely and peer-reviewed, so if anyone is after some bedtime reading on the energy market, please reach out to Tim after the session. We then also have Suzanne Falvi, who is the head of corporate affairs at AGL. So thank you everyone for joining. Merryn, I'd like to come to you first. So the Integrated System Plan, or the ISP, is a key roadmap for the industry to hit net zero. It's also a key document that the industry uses when formulating future investment decisions. Could you just talk through the ISP, its role, and the process you go through in updating it?
Yeah, great question. And the ISP is, as you say, a roadmap for the transition. That's how we very much think of it. And we do put it out there really to show what you need to do to get to net zero by 2050 across the power system. So it serves a range of purposes. From a regulatory point of view, it has a specific purpose around transmission, where there's actionable projects come out of it, but it's so much more. It takes us about 2 years, actually a little bit longer than 2 years to produce the ISP. The first year is very much taken up with working out some scenarios, all of the inputs, assumptions that go into it, obviously consulting on that, and thanks to everyone that participates in that, because it's really important that we do get input into that and we take that into account in our forecasting approaches. Like all forecasting, there's no right answer. It's a forecast and inevitably the world will be different. But we then in the second year take all of that really good inputs and assumptions and turn that into, well, what do you need to do with the power system? What will that need to look like? So starting from where we are and what we know is happening, if you want to get to net zero on the basis of those input assumptions, what have you got to do? What's the least cost pathway to get there? But taking into account things like government policies, the types of things that we know consumers will do, like invest in solar panels on their roofs, and a range of other factors like land usage, res policies, a whole bunch of things. We will always, in the ISP, we will always meet the reliability standard. That's also an input assumption. In contrast to something like the Electricity Statement of Opportunities, where we just talk about what's actually happening. And so with the ISP, we get what needs to happen, and then some of our other planning analysis shows what's actually happening, and you can see the gap in between. And that's, of course, the real opportunity for people to step up to fill that gap. So it's a huge piece of work. We try to be as transparent as we can be with the data and the data sources and the data outputs so that everyone can use them, knowing what are the inputs and assumptions in a way that helps them do whatever they want to do with that.
And And this year in the draft document, the step change scenario has been voted as the most likely scenario again. In that scenario, 90% of coal, I think, is expected to retire by 2035 and all coal by 2038. How will the generation mix change as we head to 2030 and then beyond to facilitate that?
Yeah, look, that change is going to be really profound, and I brought some numbers because it's huge. We have some what we call the hero charts in the document, and this time around we've started from history so we can see what's changed over the last 10 years. So if we just take a bit of history first and then we'll go to what we need to do to get to net zero by 2050, in just over 10 years, rooftop solar has risen from around 1% of households to 1 in 3, just in 10 years. Each year now, since 2020, we've seen over 300,000 households install 3 gigawatts of capacity on their roofs. That's 3 gigawatts. And if you put that in context, where the whole of the NEM is about somewhere in the 70 to 80 gigawatts, that's 3 gigawatts a year. That's a lot contributing, which is why people talk about that becoming the largest power station on the system. Capacity of utility scale wind and solar over that period's risen 600%, 600 to 20 gigawatts over the last decade. And we're now hitting what we refer to as renewable potential, which if you take the demand profile over the day, the potential to supply, not what's necessarily dispatched, has reached 99% of demand in October. So that's what's happened already.
Staggering.
If we want to get to net zero by 2050, on top of all the coal that's already retired, the most recent one, of course, being Liddell, but Hazelwood before that, and Northern and Playford in South Australia, etc., we can see these power stations, coal-fired power stations, reaching their end of life and needing to retire. But the projection out to 2050 is on top of what we've already got on rooftop solar. We need another 4-fold increase, 4 times as much as we already have. Coal, we forecast in the step change scenario around 50% of the current 21 gigawatts of coal capacity retires by 29-30, 90% by mid-30s, and all is retired by 2037. Grid-scale solar and wind has to triple by 2030 and increase 7-fold by 2050. And if we put that in context, at the moment we see a run rate of plant reaching full output around somewhere between 3 and 4 gigawatts a year. It varies depending on investment and supply chain and a whole bunch of things, particularly recently. But as we move out to 2030, we need that to increase to 6 gigawatts a year or a bit more. And so we really do need that investment coming through. We need really good connection processes. We need investors who want to help get through that process, 2 of which we've got here today to share how they're going to do that. But that's the kind of magnitude of things. So it's a really profound change in the generation and supply mix that we need to see.
Some of those run rates are pretty daunting, I've got to say, considering where we were last year. But gas is also expected to continue to play a role. I think capacity goes up, but overall emissions from gas comes down.
That's right. The gas story is really interesting in the ISP analysis. So we do see gas will still play an important role, and in that context, we need to remember it's net zero by 2050, not 0 by 2050. So it is a net. And in our assumptions, that could be offsets, it could be renewable gases like hydrogen or biomethane. We're not fixated on which one of those it is. We're just saying you need some kind of variable source. If you don't have that, then you'll need a lot more storage, and that's just that cost balance. But we do see, if you look at our projections, and we would like to do a little bit more work around particularly the back end in the 2040s, where there's quite significant changes. One of the things about the input and assumptions in the ISP, it is a bit about electrifying a lot of things, and I know there was a discussion about electrify everything earlier, so it does include electrification of gas and transport. And so the energy that's delivered from the NEM over the window to 2050 actually almost doubles through that electrification. And then on top of that, where you're supplying heating load in winter, you need gas-powered generation to support that. When you get some of those colder weather conditions, that's what really drives a lot of that gas story, and electricity will shift from what it currently is, a summer peaking arrangement, into a winter peaking arrangement. And so there are some of those fundamental shifts. What we tried to show with the gas analysis and the information we put in is it's very different. It won't be, peak days, multiple days a year. It will be having to run for a longer window less often, and in some years it might not run at all. And so what we're really trying to use all that really rich information that we put out in the ISP to help people understand the change that will come and why that might not be delivered from the current market settings. And hopefully people can use that to try to inform what might need to happen.
And Tim and Susan, I guess I'm interested as well in terms of your thoughts around gas and storage in your respective generation portfolios in the future.
Well, I guess the modelling that we've done, and this is kind of wearing the academic hat and had published in the Energy Journal, we were trying to think through, well, in a world where, let's say we do have to face 0-0, what kind of mix of storage would you look to achieve 100% renewables? And, very broadly speaking, you're kind of 40% shortish duration, 40% very long duration, so think of that as pumped hydro, or long duration batteries, so probably 8 to 12 hours. And then you needed 20% that could essentially go a couple of days at a time, so supporting what Merryn's mentioning there with the ISP. And that's really those dunkelflouty conditions in the middle of winter where you just get a few days in a row, very little solar, very little wind, and you've depleted your storage and you need something. And funnily enough, we haven't found in this modelling that the actual gas peakers that were running on prohibitively expensive fuel in kind of today's thinking, they actually were used to basically charge the battery so that you could then meet evening peak. Now, when I say it's prohibitively expensive, we did that analysis before the Ukrainian kind of crisis where commodity markets went crazy, and we actually kind of had an input assumption that was lower than what we got to during that crisis. So there is a lot of scope, and I think this is where we need to keep focused on average cost, not unit costs at any particular point in time, because if you've got a whole bunch of low-cost renewables, but very occasionally you need to deploy a very high-cost resource, the average cost can still be very, very manageable. So I think the critical thing for me is that the nature of that transition. So we wouldn't want to build a lot of kit today that can't be at least in some way retrofitted to get to high penetrations, high blended proportions of whether it's hydrogen, biodiesel, whatever it might look like. So that's one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit of thinking about commercially. But I guess the critical thing for me is that the gas network will be needed to operate the existing gas peaking power stations until something else is developed. And therefore a managed transition is as important for the gas industry as it is for the electricity industry.
Did you have any?
I sure do. And it is in relation to the role of gas, its agreement. We think gas will be required for a period of time, particularly for our residential, our business and our commercial customers as we move towards an electrified economy. We're very focused on making sure that that stays affordable. On storage, we have a really big focus at AGL on utility scale batteries. It's about 800 megawatts of batteries in operation, testing or construction. And as of December last year, we reached FID on our Liddell battery, which is a big 500 megawatt battery up in the Hunter. But I think, Neil, I would say, and it's reinforcing some of what we're hearing, that as a market, we still need to solve for long duration storage, the Dunkelflaut that Tim referred to, which is those periods of renewable energy droughts where the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. And on the one hand, we do see gas-fired generation as being able to fill that space because it does smooth out the transition away from coal towards renewables. And on the other hand, we're trying to do a lot of innovative thinking of how else you can solve for that problem. So for us, that's being working with other people that are doing some thinking, some strategic partnerships, like with Regen, who have got some thermal PV and thermal pumped hydro storage. And the one I really like is we have got a partnership with SLB, where we're piloting some nickel hydrogen flow battery technology. This is technology that was developed for space, but now happily is being commercialised here on Earth.
And Susan, I guess AGL, it's Australia's largest emitting company. I mean, at CommBank, we are focused on supporting the transition, not just of the market, but of our customers, as well as they transition their businesses. In 2022, you released your first Climate Transition Action Plan. Could you give an overview of the CTAP, I guess how it was developed, and then the role the ISP also plays in the CTAP?
Sure. And as I'd say, Neil, as you've heard, coal is going to close. Coal will be exiting the system, as Merryn has said, and so we do need to have replacement capacity to meet demand in place. For us, that's all about renewables and storage. I might answer your question in two parts of what actually is our CTAP before we actually move on to how it is we put it together. So at AGL, we think of our CTAP as one of the biggest decarbonisation initiatives in the country, with bringing forward the closure of our coal assets by 10 years. So our Loy Yang A brown coal power station in Victoria will be closing in 2035, 10 years earlier than originally. And we're also looking to deliver 12 gigawatts of replacement renewable and storage capacity. And we think that is really significant because closing coal 10 years earlier allows us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from what is about 40 million a year now to net zero for operated 1 and 2 emissions. I would say we're on target. We're doing really well. We have an interim target at 2030 of getting 5 gigawatts, and we've doubled our renewable development pipeline from about 3.2 gigawatts when we released our CTAP to about 5.8 gigawatts, which is about sort of doubling the ability to have all the options of deploying renewable and storage capacity in about 12 months. And we're also really on track for our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions targets as well, with the closure of the Liddell Power Station, which Merryn mentioned as well.
Yep.
In terms of how it is we put it together, I would say this is bottom-up, rigorous analysis. We went into this process with no predetermined answers in mind. We thought about all the options. We then thought about the criteria that you would need to evaluate those options, and then went about doing that. With the ISP, we use a number of the assumptions from the ISP, some of what Merryn has talked through, just to make sure that we do have consistency with that third-party, well-established scenario work that is used for planning the electricity market. We then complemented that with some pathways that speak to more AGL-specific operations. And we then also went beyond Australia and had a look at what was going on in other markets, particularly in the European market. And from that, there were a number of scenarios that we thought through, that we analysed, to be able to reach something that we think is achievable, affordable, and ambitious, I must say. And then, as you mentioned, Neil, we took that to our AGM in September 22, where our shareholders have approved it, and we're very focused on delivering it. Also focused on paying attention to market dynamics, where customer demand is at, the various options in our development pipeline. So we will look to go faster where that is possible.
I guess, 12 gigawatts is a big number as well.
Sure
so obviously
is.
that's a pretty large investment spend that's going to be required to transition and to be able to close Loy Yang in 2035.
It will be a significant investment spend, and everyone probably hears a lot because it features in the media a lot about the levels of investment that will be needed. And when we thought about an ambitious plan like this, we knew we needed to strike the right balance between how it is that we would fund the transition and reinvest in our portfolio, as well as making sure that energy does stay affordable for our customers while we do so. So AGL is looking to invest about 8 to 10 billion of its balance sheet capital into the transition. About half of that will be directly balance sheet capital. The other half will be looking to be a collection of partnership, offtakes, and other commercial agreements. And in thinking through what that investment would look like, we went back to our capital allocation framework. We changed our dividend policy, all to make sure that we have that capital flexibility that will allow us to invest in the transition, as well as continue to strengthen our core business and deliver shareholder value all at the same time. And I would just call out one other thing, Neil, is that we do actually, we've got an ageing thermal fleet, and we are spending a lot in investing in it. So there's a big focus on making sure that our assets are available and flexible. We spend up to $1 billion a year in capital expenditure of making sure that the plants are increasingly becoming more flexible, so coal doesn't necessarily ramp up and down easily. We're investing in that to be able to do that, particularly because, as Merryn highlights, we've got a lot of solar PV on our roofs, and that actually makes for lower energy demand in the middle of the day or peak solar generation, and it's important to have our assets be able to respond to that.
Right. Tim, perhaps, I mean, you could comment on Iderdrola's global investment strategy, I guess, looking from the internationally into Australia, and where do they see the opportunity in Australia, and how does Australia fit into the portfolio?
Well, I guess there's probably a couple of things that are really interesting about Australia as a destination for capital. The first is that it's got a world-class solar resource, obviously a world-class wind resource. It's got an ageing thermal fleet that needs to be replaced. But in addition to that, there's probably only a handful of places around the world that, should the export superpower scenario that Ross Garnaut talks about happen, Australia's going to be one of a handful of those places, because it's got existing ports, existing very significant expertise in bulk commodities. It's got a bit of an exposure on carbon through its exports of coal and gas. So the strategic destination for international capital makes a lot of sense. Australia looks like a really interesting place. What I'd probably say, though, that I think has been a really great working relationship that I've certainly formed with the global energy management team back over in Spain is some of the early insights that we've had here in Australia are of great use to all of the other parts of the Iderdrola world. And South Australia is probably the best example of where there's some real learnings there for the rest of the world, which is we always used to think about the only kind of real key risk is, you know, being exposed to these very high prices due to kind of a very high market price cap. But the importance of a floor that clears over supply, an acute price floor, that negative $1,000, is really, really important. And contract design is what determines whether you win or lose there, not necessarily your fuel type. And I'll give you a really simple example, that if I've got a coal-fired power station that sold a bunch of swaps, and I've got a whole bunch of renewable players that have got run-of-plant PPAs with a $0 price floor, as oversupply happens, this lot turn off before that lot. And so contract design, the importance of dynamic pricing for kind of clearing these markets when you've got not only variable demand now, but variable supply. There are some really interesting learnings for international investors out of Australia. So it's a strategic destination in itself, just because of those, you know, key strategic elements I mentioned before. But the advanced nature of what the Australian market and the Australian systems had to deal with, particularly in South Australia, there's a lot of learnings which I think Australia can then export to the world. I'm sure AEMO probably sees the same thing when it's talking to its counterparts around the world, that, you know, South Australia is a cutting edge market. Not many places around the world have that level of renewables.
I'd like to maybe come to policy, and I'll throw this question to all of you. So 2 years ago we had a change of federal government. We've now got the most supportive energy policy we've ever had in Australia for renewables, both at the federal and the state level. Yet 2023 was the quietest year in terms of new renewable projects hitting financial close. What do you think the reasons are for that? Maybe start with you, Merryn.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is a lot more policy, and when you look at the ISP and the list of policies that are included in the draft 2024 ISP compared with previous, it's quite different, which is good, and but it does frame the way in which the ISP has then planned the transition to net zero. In terms of why hasn't that translated into investment? I mean, uncertainty is obviously a key part in that, and any new policy takes a bit of time to work its way through, so that is something that we certainly are very mindful of. But I think overall, net sum positive to get that investment, because we know at AEMO, if we don't get investment, then we certainly can't operate the power system in the way that we need to keep the lights on and the gas flowing and all the other things that come with that. And so having policies that do set a pathway so that we can get the investment and then be able to then dispatch that, which is probably more where some of the market settings and the things that Tim was just talking about in terms of contract design come about. We see all that has to fit together. And so how everybody makes sure all those things fit together, I think, is it's a bit of a factor.
Tim?
Well, I guess probably the reason that you've got kind of ambitious policy here and kind of not so much going on here, there is a lot of storage being built. So that's probably a critical thing. You can't really add a lot more renewables until you've got the ability to soak up renewables, particularly in the middle of the day. New South Wales at the moment, 3.5 gigs of solar, that's large scale, plus 1.5 gigs being built, plus you've got all the small scale stuff. So there is a need for storage sooner rather than later, and I think that's where policy has had a really important impact. Transmission is key. Like transmission, if there is one thing that I could say that I'd just wave a magic wand and go back in time, it'd be to go back and kind of get the transmission build out happening 5 years ago so that we'd be a bit more advanced than what we are today. And the other thing is, I'm an economist, so you'd expect me to say this, I think that there's more of a role for markets than what governments probably collectively around the country are wanting to do at the moment. Rather than necessarily wanting to underwrite everything, markets have a really, kind of important use. They generally incentivise everybody to get on with things as quick as you can because of the time value of money, rather than fitting into a series of contract auctions. But there are kind of ways through that, and that's certainly something which I think governments over the next little while can turn their attention to. But you can't fault the ambition. It's wonderful to see ambition to wanting to solve these problems. And I guess the only other thing that I'd point out is that at every iteration in the last 20 years of policy kind of evolution, there has been a lot of people saying, oh, we'll never get it done, it'll never get done on time, it'll be too expensive, and they've been wrong every time. Markets have found a way to kind of get that investment into the market, get that new supply into the market, and often at a much lower cost than people originally anticipated.
I think I'd add to that, Neil, by just saying we just can't lose sight of what a massive undertaking the energy transition is. I mean, it's the biggest the country is in the energy space needing to undertake. People call it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And I would echo that there is a lot of ambition behind these energy targets, and it's great to see, and there are a lot of policy settings that will need to sort of follow on to help us get there. And I think, as Merryn has flagged, there is a lot of uncertainty that does need to be navigated. So we do need to get transmission built. There are supply chain issues that we need to be navigating. You do need to get equipment in from overseas and get it through ports. You do need to have a skilled workforce as well. And we're working through all of that, but that all takes time.
I guess, social licence is a really big point. It's obviously the topic of the moment when we're looking at the build-out of transmission and renewable generation into these communities as well. Is there something you think that the industry can do better in terms of engaging with communities, delivering a long-term kind of outcome for them, whether it's around infrastructure or financial incentives?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that first, if you like. Absolutely, there's something that we all need to lean into as an industry. That separation between those who have to host the infrastructure versus those that ultimately benefit from the infrastructure is stark. So when you're actually out in those communities, particularly trying to talk to them about transmission infrastructure, that they want to know what's the total impact. They don't want to know, well, we're going to put a transmission line here and then, someone else will work out what the generation stuff that comes here is going to be. They want to know what's the impact on their community as a whole. And that's not something that is clear how, what will be the total impact on them in the way in which the national electricity rules are set up at the moment, because generators can locate and connect where they choose to do that based on their own investment, where they can get land, where they can get a connection. Connections only have to meet technical requirements. It's up to the investor to work out whether they're going to be constrained or have bad MLFs and take that into account. So that's the market side of it, trying to drive those investment signals. But it's very different for the community members and the individual landholders who are impacted when you're actually out there at the kitchen table talking to them about that stuff. So I think we do need to think about that as a whole of industry, whether there's some kind of coordination, and you can see a lot of states leaning into that with things like their RES plans as opposed to kind of the go wherever you like arrangements. So that's kind of at the utility end scale. And then we also have a social licence thing that we think about at the household level. I mentioned all the solar PV going on people's roofs, and in the future there'll be behind the meter batteries and there'll be EVs and all kinds of things. We actually need that to be a part of the power system. And if you think about what is currently 3 million solar rooftops and turn into 10 million solar rooftops, there's no engineers guiding those people. There's nobody helping them understand that can be a fantastic resource that actually helps, but could also be a bit of a problem if it doesn't work with the power system. And so that social licence around, that term orchestration, which people in households think is something being done to them that could be bad, we really need to be thinking about, well, how do we get everybody to think about how they can be part of the solution and use that resource in a way that rewards them or helps them as well as helps the power system. And so we think about it from those two ends as we need to focus on both of those. And the narrative of what's the whole transition is going to be an important part of that.
Tim?
I'd probably only add just a couple of things. So we supply to a bunch of Midwest regional councils, so think central-ish West New South Wales. And having, I kind of spent most of my high school in far West New South Wales. The best presentation I've ever seen on social licence was actually Parks Council at this forum that they'd organised, thinking about how do they use low-cost renewable energy that will be produced in their region to increase economic value add. And they were really, really interesting ideas. And I think where the industry has probably not done as much as it should is think through how do we work with communities, not just for to Merryn's point, the physical infrastructure side of it, but if the energy is going to be produced in that area, why wouldn't you think about the economic value add, the new kind of manufacturing, food technology? These are the types of things that can add a lot of value to regional communities. And then you get more jobs staying in the towns, you get economic activity, vibrant kind of communities that are powered by renewables, so everybody can kind of get behind that. The other point on social licence that I'd make, and I make this at every forum I go to, is that we have to resolve some of the inequity in solar PV that goes in behind the meter. If you own your own home, you have a distinct advantage over those that don't own their own home, and the way we recover costs is not fair. It disproportionately impacts those people who don't have PV, who don't have batteries, and we've got to get that right, because we're starting to see that play out now in things like how the AER is thinking about the DMO, and if we don't get those right longer term, it's just not a fair outcome, and it's not going to be a just transition for those people that can't have access to those distributed technologies.
Neil, I think I'd add to that by acknowledging that social licence it's critical at AGL has been around for 187 years. It has had some very long-standing relationships with community, so we really understand how important it is to get out there early and often and engage with the community. To add to what we've just heard, I would say for us, social license around existing assets is as important as the new ones that we're looking to build. And I think of, I mentioned our closure of the Liddell Power Station last year, and that was one where there was a lot of planning that went into it, a lot of engagement with the community. So we gave the market and the community 7 years' notice. There were a lot of detailed thinking around the workforce. We made a commitment about no forced redundancies as a result of that power station, which we delivered. And the planning also allowed us to think through things like circular economy. So and now bringing that power station to a close, about 90% of its materials will be recycled. There's enough steel to make another Sydney Harbour Bridge, I think, that's currently being recycled. And that's an important part of us transitioning that site to being an energy hub. And an energy hub is then again in supporting the community. So for us, it's social licence is as important about the existing as well as the new.
Thanks, Susan. I'm conscious of time because I can see the clock down there moving quickly. I'd like to maybe come to you each just for some final thoughts. Kind of two things when we think about the energy transition. First, what's the thing that makes you wake up in night with a little bit of fear about how we're going? Second, what's a dose of optimism? What helps you go back to sleep with how we're going and transitioning the system? So maybe starting with you, Merryn.
The thing that keeps me awake is, can we plan the system well enough that we'll be able to keep the lights on and the economy running in real time? Because it is still a real-time power system. So that planning piece, to do that, that's what keeps me awake. But what gives me optimism is that, we've got the smartest people ever helping us do that planning, and that's my team at AEMO. They're so committed, they're so purpose-driven, they really want to make a difference, they're really passionate about it, and I think if, we've got the best minds on the job to solve the problem.
Tim?
Not that it keeps me up at night. The thing that I think is probably the thing that's not kind of focused on enough is the managed transition of the gas network. Because, the gas network, like the electricity network, has all these technical parameters around minimum flows and all these types of things, and just assuming that it will all kind of be okay, I think is probably, brave, and we need to kind of, manage that a little bit better. The thing that I'm really optimistic about, though, is to Merryn's point, every day going into the office at, Iderdrola, I'm surrounded by some of the most brilliant, young, passionate people. And, I say this as someone who's kind of got a lot of grey hair, but the young people that are coming into our workforce are so passionate, they are so smart. And the thing that I find so amazing about them is they're prepared to call BS on things that they don't kind of see as kind of fitting with their values. And I think that's what's going to keep this system kind of, keep it going.
Thanks, Neil. I think Tim picked up on this, but one of the things that I get most worried or concerned about is whether there is a good enough understanding of the energy transition, what it is that we're doing, what goes into an energy bill, the questions that we're facing, the answers that we need to be coming up with, whether there's a good enough understanding of that across the general public, because it does go to having an informed debate and some of the social licence issues that we spoke about. And in terms of what, again, to echo the optimism, it is a really big undertaking, the energy transition, but there's also a lot of coordination. You do see industry and government coordinating, and coordination will be really important, because the more we coordinate, the more the transition will be affordable. And I do get a lot of comfort from thinking we are all pulling in the right direction.
And maybe just to finish up, I think the decarbonisation of the electricity sector is not just important, it's economy-wide. You think of all the other sectors that will decarbonise through the work that everyone on this panel is doing. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together for the panel? Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your time at Momentum. Cheers.